The room was quiet, too quiet for the weight it carried. A man sat alone, his back slightly curved, his fingers pressed together, as though he was holding a fragile secret between his palms. Outside the window, the San Francisco sky was gray, indifferent. Inside, Sundar Pichai stared at nothing. His eyes were heavy, as if they were made not of flesh and blood, but of glass, carrying the reflection of years of choices. He had built empires with words, systems with logic, futures with data. And yet, at this moment, what he carried most was not triumph, but the silence of consequence. It is in silence that decisions echo the loudest. Years before, he had not been the most obvious candidate. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the one who demanded to be seen. He was quiet, deliberate, often underestimated. But power has a way of choosing those who least expect it. His rise was not accidental. It was a calculation, a sequence of choices strung together, like invisible threads pulling him upward, until one day he found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the world beneath, forced to make a choice that would define not only him, but billions. This is not a story of triumph. This is a story of weight, of the price of choosing silence when the world demanded a voice. The first glimpse of power years before he became the man in the quiet office, Sundar was a boy in Chennai, India. The house he grew up in was modest, cramped even, filled with the hum of fans and the constant smell of kerosene. There was no luxury, only necessity. But there was also curiosity in mind that refused to stop asking, why? Why did metal heat and bend the way it did? Why did wires carry sound across impossible distances? Why could information live inside objects no bigger than a fingernail? When he first touched a computer, it was not love at first sight. It was something deeper, something closer to reverence. Here was not just a machine. Here was a door. But doors are useless without the courage to walk through them. For years, Sundar carried that quiet hunger. He did not roar like others. He studied, observed, listened. He went further than most first, to IIT Karagar, then to Stanford, then to Wharton. Every step was a migration not only across geography, but across worlds, from scarcity to abundance, from anonymity to the corridors of power. And yet, even in the heart of Silicon Valley, he remained the quiet one, the engineer who spoke less, but whose words bent the conversation when he chose to open his mouth. The dilemma every empire has a moment when silence becomes betrayal. For Sundar, that moment came not with a product, but with a choice. It was 2015. Google, the giant that had grown too fast, too vast, was no longer a company. It was a hydra. Too many heads, too many battles, too many leaders, each pulling in their own direction. The founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, were visionaries, but visionaries eventually grow weary of the mundane weight of management. Someone needed to step in. Someone needed to bear the burden. Sundar was offered the crown, CEO, the master of the machine that powered the modern world. But crowns are never gifts. They are traps wrapped in velvet. To accept meant not only leading a company, but inheriting every demon it had birthed, the growing unease about surveillance, the whispers of monopolistic power, the internal revolts of employees who no longer saw their company as a playground of innovation, but as a weapon wielded by governments and corporations alike. To refuse meant letting someone else bear that weight, someone perhaps less careful, less restrained, and so he chose. In the silence of his office, far from cameras and applause, he whispered the only word that mattered. Yes. The assent at first, the crown seemed to fit. He was the perfect antidote to chaos. Calm, thoughtful, unshaken by storms. Under his leadership, Google's reach grew even further. Chrome dominated the internet. Android became the lifeline of billions. Artificial intelligence, once a distant dream, began to slip into everyday life, whispered through search bars and recommendation engines. To the outside world, it looked like triumph. But every triumph casts a shadow. Behind closed doors, Sundar began to notice the cracks. Decisions that once felt like progress now looked like weapons. The company's tools were shaping not only markets, but minds. Every search, every click, every whispered query into a phone microphone became fuel for a machine no one could stop. And there, in that unstoppable growth, came the moment that would haunt him. The decision. It was 2018 when the storm broke. Inside Google, whispers became protests. Thousands of employees walked out, furious over a contract Project Maven, a collaboration with the Pentagon. Artificial intelligence used not for harmless queries, but for war. Drones guided by algorithms. Decisions of life and death made not by soldiers, but by code. The protests rattled the company. They rattled Sundar. In those days, he barely slept. His phone buzzed with messages. His inbox drowned in anger. Employees demanded clarity. Governments demanded loyalty. Investors demanded profit. The world demanded a choice. Should Google, the company whose motto once was "Don't be evil," continue building tools of surveillance and war? Or should it walk away, sacrificing billions, angering governments, and risking retaliation? Sundar sat in his office, staring at the decision, his face pale, his fingers pressed together. He thought of the boy in Chennai who once marveled at the beauty of technology. He thought of the man now entrusted with its darkest powers. If he chose profit, he would betray the ideals that had once defined the company. If he chose principle, he would betray the investors who trusted him, the governments who courted him, the board that watched him. Every option carried a cost. Every silence carried a weight. And so he decided. With measured words, with the same calm that had carried him all his life, he announced that Google would step away from Project Maven. That I would not be built for weapons. That there were lines they would not cross. It was a victory, for a moment. But victories built on silence rarely last. The shadow of China, even as one fire was extinguished, another began to burn. Whispers leaked that Google was working on a secret Project Dragonfly, a censored search engine for China, a tool that would bend not to users, but to the will of the government. Queries silenced, truths buried, voices erased. Once again, Sundar was at the center. Once again, the world demanded a choice. He tried to explain, to balance, to say that exploration was not commitment. But in the shadows of those explanations lay the truth. To build such a tool was to trade morality for access, principle for profit. And once again, he chose silence. He did not deny. He did not confirm. He waited, letting the storm pass. But silence is never neutral. Silence is a decision. The weight by now, Sundar had everything. The power, the wealth, the respect. And yet, in the rare moments when the cameras were gone, when the speeches ended, when he sat alone in the quiet of his office, he felt the weight pressing down. He had risen by listening, by being careful, by speaking only when his words carried certainty. But the higher he rose, the more he realized that silence had its own consequences. Yes, he had walked away from weapons, but he had also allowed surveillance to grow unchecked. Yes, he had chosen not to build a war machine, but he had also allowed voices to be silenced in nations where truth itself was forbidden. The boy who once saw technology as a door now understood. Some doors cannot be closed once opened. Reflection, in the end, the decision that defined Sundar Pichai was not a single choice, but a pattern. The decision to rise quietly. The decision to accept the crown. The decision to step away from some evils while tolerating others. The decision to let silence be his shield, even when the world demanded his voice. And now, years later, as he sat alone in his office, staring into the gray sky, he finally admitted what he had always feared. That every decision, even the quiet ones, exacts a price. That the weight he carried was not power, not wealth, but the invisible toll of silence. He was a man who had chosen carefully, deliberately, cautiously. And yet, in the end, he could not escape the truth. Silence is never free. The silence echoes still. The silence lingered long after the decisions were made. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a battlefield after the smoke clears, when the echoes of distant cries still haunt the air. Sundar Pichai carried that silence like a second skin. To the world, he was the calm leader, the careful hand guiding Google into its next era. To himself, he was a man slowly suffocating under the weight of choices too vast for one human being to hold. The hidden cost every CEO inherits more than a company. They inherit ghosts. For Sundar, the ghosts were everywhere. The ghost of trust, shattered by projects the public was never meant to see. The ghost of innovation, poisoned by the endless hunger for data. The ghost of freedom, betrayed by the compromises made in boardrooms, far from the eyes of users. He had tried once to believe that technology could exist without corruption. But the higher he climbed, the clearer it became. Technology was no longer neutral. It was power. And power always demanded allegiance. Each quarter brought new battles. Regulators in Europe, hearings in Washington, investigations in India. Everywhere, the same accusation. Google had grown too large, too dominant, too dangerous. And Sundar, always calm, always measured, sat before the microphones, speaking in the same careful tone, as though words alone could wash away the sins of the machine he commanded. But behind the calm exterior, the truth gnawed at him. Every promise he made, every reassurance he whispered, was another weight tied to his soul. The illusion of control, there is a secret few will ever admit. CEOs do not control empires. They ride them. The machine is too vast, the momentum too great. Sundar realized this the day he tried to slow it down. He had suggested restraint in AI deployment guidelines, limitations, ethical frameworks. He believed, naively, that the company could pause, reflect, create a code of honor before unleashing intelligence that would one day surpass their own. But restraint is a language Wall Street does not speak. His board frowned. Investors whispered. Engineers, restless and hungry, left for competitors who promised no breaks, no chains, no hesitation. And so the machine roared forward with or without him. Sundar's role was not to stop it, but to guide it, to polish the edges, to soften the language, to make the unstoppable feel inevitable. Control was an illusion. But illusions, if maintained long enough, become truth. The loneliness of the crown power isolates. Friends become advisors. Advisors become rivals. Rivals become shadows. In the early years, Sundar had leaned on mentors. Larry and Sergey, the eccentric founders, were his North Star. But they, too, drifted away, retreating into their own worlds, leaving him alone with the hydra they had birthed. At home, he tried to be a father, a husband, a man. But how does one bring home the weight of billions? How does one sit at the dinner table after a day spent deciding not just the fate of a company, but the architecture of truth itself? He found himself retreating into silence, even with those closest to him. His family learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. They asked fewer questions. He gave fewer answers. Loneliness does not arrive with thunder. It seeps in quietly, until one day you look around and realize that the only voice left is your own. The breaking point, every life has a fracture, a moment when the mask slips. For Sundar, it came in 2020. The pandemic had reshaped the world. People locked in their homes turned to Google not just for answers, but for survival. What time are vaccines available? Which hospitals still have beds? What is safe? What is not? What is truth? What is lie? Billions of searches. billions of cries for clarity, and every answer carried consequence. If the algorithm failed, people could die. If the algorithm succeeded, it would reshape entire nations' responses. Sundar lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the weight of those invisible lives pressing on his chest. He had once believed technology was about curiosity, about exploration. Now it was about survival. And survival meant mistakes carried blood. One evening, after another endless day of meetings, he caught his reflection in the window of his office. The man staring back was not the boy from Chennai, not the engineer who marveled at the beauty of code. He was something else, something heavier, something older than his years. And in that reflection, for the first time, he felt fear. Not fear of failure, not fear of investors or governments. Fear of himself, of the decisions he had made, of the silence he had chosen, of the machine he had allowed to grow. The paradox of victory, the irony of success, is that it often feels indistinguishable from defeat. Under Sundar, Google's revenue soared. Its reach expanded into every corner of the earth. Its innovations defined the future. By every external metric, he had won. And yet, inside, he felt the opposite. For what is victory when it leaves you hollow? What is triumph when it costs you your peace? He had dreamed once of building doors to knowledge, windows to possibility. But the doors had become walls. The windows had become cages. In the quiet hours, when no one was watching, he wondered, had he saved the world from darker forces by guiding Google with restraint? Or had he merely delayed the inevitable, giving it the mask of benevolence while feeding it the same poison? The paradox consumed him. He was both savior and prisoner, both leader and hostage. The final reflection years later, as the shadows of his career lengthened, Sundar allowed himself a rare moment of honesty. He stood once more at the edge of decision, not about a project, not about a policy, but about himself. What had it all been for? The wealth, the power, the endless headlines, they felt distant, almost meaningless. What lingered instead were the faces, the angry employees during the walkouts, the cautious board members demanding profits, the governments pressing for cooperation, the billions of users who had given him their trust without ever knowing his name, and above all, the boy in Chennai, the boy who had once touched a computer and seen a door. He whispered into the silence of his office, the same way he had whispered the word yes years ago when he took the crown. Was it worth it? No one answered. There are some questions even technology cannot answer. The lesson Sundar Pichai's story is not one of villains or heroes. It is a story of weight, of the impossible price of leadership in an age where information is power and power is everything. He rose by being cautious, by choosing silence when others shouted. It was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. For silence can protect, but it can also condemn. His life is a reminder that decisions are not measured only in dollars or victories, but in the shadows they cast. That sometimes the cost of avoiding one evil is allowing another to grow unchecked. And that in the end, the quietest decisions often scream the loudest. Epilogue: the office is empty now. The chair still sits by the window. The sky is still gray. Sundar Pichai remains a figure of power, a name tied to innovation, progress, and the relentless march of technology. But beneath the polished speeches, the corporate triumphs, and the public image of calm leadership lies a truth too easily forgotten, that every crown is heavy, that every choice leaves scars, and that even in silence, decisions echo forever. The boy who once touched a computer and saw a door never imagined the shadows waiting on the other side. But he walked through anyway,